Good evening and welcome to the Sullen Art Podcast, episode 7. I'm Iqbal Malik, and joining me as usual is my co-host, Simon Howard Jones.
Good evening.
Good evening, Simon. How are we doing, bud?
Very, very good, and really quite excited. I should say that I've been trying to do the introduction about 3 times. That's why Iqbal's had to do it.
Well,
I'll leave that in the podcast.
I think I've just scraped over the line.
I'm ready to go because our guest tonight is really exciting me because there's lots of things to talk about.
Yeah. So our guest this evening is Howard Ingham. Evening, Howard. How are you doing, bud?
Hi, I'm fine. Good to meet you guys. Good to
Yeah,
have
we're a man down though. Again this week, our other co-host Chris Horgan is recovering from I don't really know how to describe it.
a freak barbecue injury.
A freak injury, but he's okay. He's all good. He's on the mend.
We wish to send our best to Chris.
Sorry to hear that.
So, where do we start?
We
have a hefty tome front of us.
And it is a hefty tome.
It's
a big old book, isn't it?
Really nicely put together. How would you describe it, Howard?
Essentially, it's 3 years worth of self-therapy, mainly. I was going through an exceptionally tough time back in 2016 for various reasons, not worth going into, and I decided to have a Halloween movie marathon. And I decided to have a folk horror themed Halloween movie marathon. I had a blog and I wasn't sure what to do with it at the time. And I had recently realized that most of my favorite horror films were actually considered to be part of this thing that people were excited about, which they were calling folk horror. And I was like, what's folk horror? Oh, it's The Wicker Man. I love that movie. Oh, it's Wisconsin Death Trip. I love that movie. Oh, it's The Company of Wolves. That's an amazing movie. And I went through the list and I'm like, oh, The Witch. I just saw that the other week. It's like fantastic, And I realised actually that it crystallised a lot of what had always been my preoccupations. So as a kid, growing up in a home which you don't realise when you're a kid, but when you get older, you realize you meet normal people and you realize that actually your family was really strange. And so some of the things that my parents were into were kind of non-standards. And my dad had this amazing forbidden bookshelf full of 70s tomes of magic and the occult and all sorts of like occult ephemera, and a pile of occult magazines stashed away, which I used to sneak looks at because I wasn't allowed to go to the forbidden bookshelf. I wasn't allowed to read his occult magazines, and I did anyway.
LaVey's Satanic Bible, is that a stretch to imagine that LaVey's Satanic Bible was there as well, perhaps?
Actually, no.
Right, okay.
My mum wouldn't have that in the house.
And I totally agree with her because I'm not a big fan of that book myself.
I got
Well, I've not read it. I mean, what's that about?
LaVey and Satanism is basically just an excuse to be a dick and sleep with lots of girls.
I have to shake this man's hand, right? And I'll tell you for why, right? I don't want to jump in on this. I read the first paragraph, right? I don't want to try and get myself into trouble with any sort of anything here because somebody might listen to this and go, how dare you, and invoke the wrong kind of spirits or whatever. But what really irritates me, there's a preface, how do I pronounce that?
Preface, it doesn't matter.
There is a small section where he is lamenting about why he developed Satanism in its context in the late 50s, 60s. And he came from I'm not ad-libbing here, but I'm not getting it completely right. He came from quite a devout, Bible belt bashing family.
Because of course he did.
And he watched some of the preachers in the day, fire and brimstone, and then in the evening they would be canoodling with girls who were probably not of the age that they should have been. And he was like, I saw the hypocrisy and I thought, yeah, I'm going to have a slice of that myself. And it's like, well, my brain couldn't compute that. I was like, well, hang on a minute. If I had seen that, well, I'd want to go harder the other way, as in, no, this is wrong. What you're doing is wrong. Let's course correct here. So I just found it very hypocritical. It didn't make any sense. It wasn't logical. And when you get into the back, there's lots of incantations and it gives you all these things to summon up different demons and deities from hell.
I'm assuming he wrote that book then.
Oh yeah,
he wrote it.
So he wrote that. I mean, is that a banned book or is it?
No. It's widely available. Yeah.
You can get it in a mass market paperback. I know a poem about Anton LaVey. Roses are red, teapots have handles. The vein Satanism is Ayn Rand with candles.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting indeed. Okay. And then I shrugged. But sorry. Wow. No, I never made that. No. I'm impressed.
I didn't write that.
No, that's good. Like, that's good. But let's get back to
magic of the internet. But yeah, so essentially, I was into folk horror. Not that 1970s, particularly style of fantasy and horror, which is kind of homemade, kind of rural, kind of about the woods. Generally, you find that the horror is caused by ordinary people. It's ordinary people who are haunted. There's a real difference between Christopher Lee as Dracula, as distant Transylvanian nobleman in his far-off castle, and Lord Summerisle, who's the chummy Scottish laird who just hangs around in his tweed jacket and indulges in conspiracy to murder and abuse children on an industrial scale. So, it's a different sort of thing. It's like Dracula preys on the heaving bosomed maidens and turns them into his vampiric court, while Lord Summerisle essentially gives uptight Scottish policemen the runaround and sort of smiles as teenage girls dance naked around a fire in his back garden. It's no less creepy, but it's somehow a bit more relatable. But also the 1970s, it's the last period where you could have things that were in the mass media that were still a bit homemade. One of the things that some people raised some eyebrows in We Don't Go Back was that I included Bagpuss as an example of the sort of thing that comes from a folk horror era. The idea of Bagpuss as a thing that is homemade, but on the TV. And it was on the TV all the time. In researching it, I discovered that Bagpuss was actually repeated in its entirety about 11 times, like more than pretty much any other TV show, really. And that's really interesting as to why it might be. And so to discover, actually, you as a child, you sort of think some things are always on the TV. Bagpuss was always on the TV. It was actually from 1970, when it was made, right up until 1986. It was on all the time, constantly. And these things kind of stick with us. And it's interesting that folk horror is making a comeback now.
Howard, just to interject slightly. So this book of yours is called
We Don't Go Back.
We Don't Go Back. But the strapline then for the book is it's a watcher's guide to folk horror. Yeah. So, I mean, I know a little bit now about the term folk horror because I've read your intro. But, I mean, how would you describe folk horror generally? I mean, how would you get other people to get their head around that?
Well, okay, so it's always really, really dangerous to define folk horror because folk horror's got like a really, really keen fandom. Sometimes you turn up and you go various Facebook groups and discussion groups and somebody will turn up and go, here's my favourite film. Is it folk horror? And all these people will just like have a big long discussion about whether it's folk horror. And then one of the folk horror police will turn up and go, it's not folk horror, no. And all those sorts of things. Because folk horror as a thing is something that we arbitrarily decided was a thing in about 2010. So Mark Gatiss, of the League of Gentlemen and Doctor Who fame and Sherlock and all those things, he did a documentary series called A History of Horror on BBC 4. And he did an episode, and halfway through the episode on British horror, he talked about folk horror. And he called it folk horror. And he basically said, okay, the three main texts of folk horror are Witchfinder General, which you've probably heard of, The Wicker Man, which you've probably heard of, and Blood on Satan's Crawl, which you may not have heard of, but you might have. So a less famous film.
And those ones you described are in the opening chapter, I think, aren't they?
Yeah.
Because you from what I gather, from what I've seen, you've basically tried to group certain films together, haven't you?
Yes, indeed. So you start with those foundational texts. I also added to the main three, a sort of plus one, which was Night of the Demon, which is a classic 1950s British horror film, which doesn't really fit anywhere else, but is still central. It's based on an M.R. James story. So then I did an entire section about British TV. I did a section about other British folk horror movies. I did a section about fairy tale movies, dark fairy tales, which are very much part of the folk horror thing. And then children's stuff, children's folk horror, so Watership Down, Bagpuss, things like Children of the Stones or Moondial. Do you remember Moondial? You're about the right age.
I remember.
Yeah.
It used to irritate me.
I do a bit about the folk horror episodes of things like Robin of Sherwood and Doctor Who, because Doctor Who did folk horror about half a dozen times.
And this is not a criticism. I have never written a book of this quality before, and I probably never will. But there is one tiny thing with the children's horror or TV thing you might have omitted, and I might be wrong. I just want to sort of ask, if I may. Am I allowed to?
You can ask.
The Cosgrove Hall production of Wind in the Willows, the stop frame animation.
See, I thought of that.
I think it has some very, even thinking about it now, it sort of sends the hairs up on me. It's some very creepy moments, and it's some quite, hang on a minute. Maybe that's in the context of my age, and I live quite close to a common, top of West Cross and Mumbles. So when I was a kid, I would look over at Craigenos school, and my parents would say, that's where Mr. Toad lives, and over there is the Wild Wood. Because it was like a little set of woodlands. But there were some episodes of that which were bloody terrifying to me as a kid.
Yeah, and
that's the only thing I would say.
Well, no, I think it's fair. I think one of the things I do mention as a side thing is that Cosgrove Hall did an amazingly creepy animated version of the Pied Piper of Hamelin in the same style as The Wind in the Willows.
That was I think I remember that. I think I saw that on BBC One. It was like one of those 5-minute short things.
It's about 10 minutes long. Robert Hardy did the narration.
Yeah.
He narrates the Browning poem. And the animation is by the people who did The Wind in the Willows, and it's done by Cosgrove Hall. It's got their signature stop motion style from that era. And it's super creepy. And even it holds up. You can find it on YouTube if you look. And because there isn't actually, I don't feel guilty about finding it on YouTube because there isn't actually a current DVD available of it, sadly. But it's really something.
And not to go off on a sort of side tangent here, Cosgrove Hall.
This is a podcast. It's all about the side tangents.
Cosgrove, it really irritates me that Cosgrove Hall doesn't get the same sort of veneration on new media that a lot of other companies do, because there were some fantastic things. I mean, Danger Mouse alone, you've got Avenger Penguins.
It's going a bit like Jamie and the Magic Torch.
Was it Chorlton and the Wheelies?
Chorlton and the Wheelies.
Very creepy as well, with was it Fenella the witch, and also Alias the Jester, which I thought was
Alias the Jester.
Do you ever remember that?
I do. There was a little bit. I think I was just getting a little bit too old for that, but I remember seeing it. I don't remember much. I remember Jamie and the Magic Torch. I remember Cockleshell Bay.
I don't remember that. Portland Bill, I remember.
Portland Bill, but no, Cockleshell Bay.
Why does Jamie and the Magic Torch kind of come under that genre?
Jamie and the Magic, well, it doesn't really, but it's super surreal and strange.
But I think what Howard's referring to, and this is why I was sort of bringing up Wind in the Willows, because I feel, for me, when you watch a lot of big production stuff from Hollywood and the UK, it's lost that homespun quality about it. And I don't want to sort of interject too much, but for me, there's nothing that beats Wind in the Willows for me for a series, and then Oh, Mr. Toad, which is the series that was released 2 or 3 years after the initial run was done, of something that's made with actual care. It feels
I think
real.
The very last thing that you could sort of consider to be made in that kind of vein would be Wallace and Gromit, and
absolutely.
stuff like that.
Yeah,
where you can, on the big screen versions. I remember seeing The Curse of the Were-Rabbit in the cinema with my father-in-law, who just spent the entire time weeing himself laughing.
It's brilliant.
Bless him. But you can see thumbprints on the plasticine on the big screen. You can see that someone moved those plasticine models with their hands. And that's really, really powerful.
So where do you stand with someone like Wes Anderson then, sort of trying to bring it back in a way? Because the Fantastic Mr. Fox, I feel don't believe he's never seen Wind in the Willows, because there's echoes of that in that adaptation of Roald Dahl's book in the movie that he did. And also Isle of Dogs. Isle of Dogs, I think, has got some moments in the stop frame animation. He must at some point delved into something.
Oh, I think he's an Anglophile, certainly. I have a love-hate relationship with Wes Anderson's
Can I ask
films.
why?
Well, some of his films are great.
Okay.
And some of his films disappear up their own butt end.
What ones do you think disappear?
Well, I didn't really like the Grand Budapest Hotel.
I enjoyed that. There was moments I thought it was ridiculous. The sense of ridiculous.
Yeah, but
okay.
but on the other hand, Rushmore.
Yeah.
It's one of my favourite films, partly because I relate to the main character in more ways than I could probably sort of express. But Rushmore is quite powerful. I really like the Royal Tenenbaums, but I don't know, a lot of... The thing is, right, I've seen Harold and Maude.
Yeah.
The 1960s film, and I don't know if you've ever seen that. And Harold and Maude is the film that Wes Anderson tried to make over and over again. You know, it's basically, once you see Harold and Maude, you go, that's where he's getting it
Remind me what happens in Harold and Maude.
Harold and Maude is about a 19-year-old with a death fixation who begins a love affair with a woman in her late 60s who is really alive and really young at heart and really bright, and who has a number tattooed on the inside of her arm. And because it's never said out loud, but, you know, she's Jewish.
Right. Okay. So, yes. Okay.
And he finds his youth in her, and she is able to let go at the end of the film. And it's a powerful, powerful film while being quirky as all get out. It's an amazing film. It's one of my very favourite films. It's really, really great. And you can sort of see, but the style of it, and the whole quirkiness of it, and the whole thing that Wes Anderson has about eccentric rich people, is right down there in Harold and Maude. It's right there. And I think that, you sort of see that. And I mean, Wes Anderson wants to do the homemade thing. You know, like, for example, every single one of his films, the credits are written in Futura. They're in the same font. He's got like this specific kind of aesthetic that he's going on, but it's not homemade because he's clearly thrown a lot of budget at it. It's like, it's not a homemade thing. It's like a sort of like hugely tooled, machined thing that's kind of buffed and scratched on the edges afterwards deliberately to look homemade. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because these are beautifully crafted films. But I don't really know what it is about them that makes me sort of sit there and go, yeah, Wes Anderson, I'm not sure what you did there.
The authenticity you feel isn't there.
Well, see, authenticity, what even is authenticity? I think authenticity sort of...
Well, I understand what you're saying, but like I've had this discussion before on the podcast with Iqbal, when it comes to the context of music. I will listen to anything so long as I believe what the person is saying. And then by proxy, if I'm watching a film, I will believe... Look,
yeah,
I'll surrender my cards at the table here. My favourite genre is buddy cop movies. I can't help it, right? I just
cannot fault.
No. One of my favourite films of all time is Beverly Hills Cop 1. I think it's genius. It just is. It's got one of the greatest scenes ever in it, which I've discussed with you, with the staff sergeant who comes in, who acts as a surrogate father, who comes in and goes, "It's Foley in here," and he just tears Axel Foley anew, and it's this whole dynamic of the father-son relationship, and it's just so perfectly played out. But I've forgotten where I was going. So I'm probably not the best person to sort of theorise on film, but where was I going? I've forgotten.
Why are you not the best person to theorise on film?
Because I'm Bluffer's Guide.
I think
this is a Bluffer's Guide. Here is the thing. Okay, one of the things... No. One of the things about the way in which I've approached film criticism in the book is that essentially I just write down what the film makes me feel and think about.
Yeah.
Okay, and I realised at some point, quite early on, that these days, the sort of film guide that you would traditionally have, where people would tell you what was in the film, who was in the film, who made the film, how long it is, production details and stuff like
Isn't
that.
it the Collins book, the large Collins books? Is that what you're sort of referring to?
Yeah, things like the big phone book sized guides you could get
know the ones you mean. No one ever gets 1 star over 1 star. Yeah.
It's 5 seconds on the IMDb. You don't need to look for this stuff. You don't need to come up with facts. Stories are more interesting. But even so, a lot of these stories are on the IMDb, like famously, for instance, Witchfinder General, right? Was directed by a man called Michael Reeves. He was in his 20s. It's like his 3rd or 4th film. And Vincent Price was being a big prima donna, the old grandmaster of
My name
horror.
is Hopkins, Witchfinder. Sorry. Witchfinder General.
And he's acting up, and at one point Reeves just basically stops and just tears him a new one. And he stands there and he says, "I've made 200 films, young man. How many have you made?" And he goes, 3 good ones.
Excellent comeback.
And at that point, Price basically dialed it right back and did exactly what he was told for the rest of the film.
So Wood, your book then, just to get back to basics for just very briefly,
It's never brief with me.
It's never brief. It's
I'm
never
glad it isn't brief.
Well, I'll make it as brief as possible. So the book, you were talking about Room 207 Press, all right, towards the beginning of the podcast, and what, you're looking confused?
No, I'm intrigued in what you're going to say.
Oh, right, okay. No, it's really a sort of small conversation we're having off air about printing costs and kind of doing it yourself, this sort of DIY route. And the self-publishing thing, because obviously as part of Frequency House, we're doing similar projects.
Always interested.
Because you were saying, Wood, that you will do it print on demand through Amazon.
Yeah, I self-publish. Actually, because in 2016 I did a book of essays about Atlantis and the popular occult and about weird history, and it's called The Age of Miracles. You can still find it on Amazon. And I kickstarted it. I did a Kickstarter and funded it, and it was modestly successful. I made my target, and it turned out to make me, without naming money, more money than if I had gone through the traditional route of doing a publisher. And without wanting to boast unduly about We Don't Go Back, We Don't Go Back has been phenomenally successful. It's been the single most successful thing I have ever done in 20 years of freelancing and producing my own work. It has essentially been responsible for half of my revenue this last year.
Wow.
It's been mentioned in all sorts of places. I've been asked to do talks at events, universities. I've had people contact me to tell me that I've been cited in their master's theses and film studies, which is just shocking because it's simply me just writing what I think about books. Right, I hadn't realised that I'm not a peer-reviewed academic book at all. I'm not a researcher, but people are citing me. People are talking about my book. At StokerCon, I met people who were themselves nominated for writing stuff. There's a woman called Gwendolyn Keist, and she wrote a book called The Rust Maidens, which is, one of the most exciting novels I've read in years, and it won the First Novel Award, which is the most prestigious because it's the only one that you can only ever be nominated for once, if you think about it. And she won that, and I met Gwendolyn, and she was like, you wrote We Don't Go Back. I love that book. And I lost the ability to conversation. I completely failed to, I was like, oh, shit, yeah, right, thank you, yeah, really? and the idea that people might actually have read my book and know about it, and that the book's got word of mouth and things is quite shocking. But going back to the whole business aspect of it, which is kind of what you really want to know about, I think there are places and there are sectors where it makes more sense to self-publish. Niche non-fiction, which seems to be, since about 2016, my thing. Niche non-fiction pays proper money if you do it yourself. If you go through a publisher, you get pennies. You go through an agent, an agent takes their 5%, the publisher takes everything, you might get 50p a copy. Right. The mathematics of self-publishing, when you are doing niche non-fiction where the volumes are necessarily lower, right, are quite important. So, for example, I was, in grand terms, is modestly successful. I'm not going to be able to retire off the proceeds, right? But I sold more copies than Jacob Rees-Mogg did of his book, which...
It's not hard.
Glad to hear that.
No, it's not hard, but it's still more than I've ever sold of anything. So the fact that I've lost count of how many I've sold. I think it's getting on for 1,000 copies, but it's not bad.
So for people out there who want to get on the self-publishing route, how would you sort of advise them in terms of what to do, what the process is, etc.?
I think crowdfunding isn't a bad idea if you know where to publicise it, if you know where to support it. Things like Kickstarter are a good thing to do. I have a Patreon page as well. Patreon is a place where people can subscribe to see your work. And because I've got a blog where I write stuff, and the blog is the testing spot for stuff that eventually ends up in books, people pay to see my work early. So I make it's modest, it's $100 American, and that pays for the DVDs of films that I watch and talk about, right? So there's that. Kickstarter. I kickstarted We Don't Go Back. I set it at £1,200, I think my target was. I made 3 times that on the Kickstarter. Of that, about at least half was profit. The rest was the cost of actually printing them up and sending them to backers and things like that. But the fact that you create a Kickstarter, it works as a pre-order for people to then tell other people about it. It's a kick-off for it. Because if people miss the Kickstarter, then when it goes on general sale, they can still buy it. And that seems to have snowballed. It helps, actually, if you've got something. I think what I would say about self-publishing is that you try and make the nicest looking package you can.
Well, I was going to say, this is a really polished, really lovely looking book. How did you get that level of quality on it?
I'm fortunate enough to have worked for my day job as a professional in publishing. And
where did you do that, Wood?
Well, I'm a freelancer, so I've worked for various people. I've worked in the past for The Big Issue. I did some editing for the British government at one point. That was horrific, actually. That was a public inquiry into hospitals where people were dying years ago in Staffordshire. I've done editing on incredibly boring stuff about... I think I did a guide for county councils about how to recycle plastic, all that sort of thing. I did inspirational Bible stories for kids. I've done all these things. I've edited a magazine and laid it out and sold advertising, because when you're freelance, you can't afford to specialise. And along the way, the skills I picked up were skills in professional print design packages. So,
but you were also saying off air that the sort of template you can download and use off Amazon
Yeah.
It's a workable.
It's workable.
It's a great tool by the sound of it.
It's workable. It's a great tool. It's not necessarily going to help you. If you can, one of the things that I would say about a Kickstarter is that if it's successful, it might enable you to get the cash to drop 100 quid on someone who can make your book look nice, someone who's got the skills to make your book look nice, and that sort of thing. So, for example, my book would never have. Let me hold it. My book would never have done as well, I think, if I hadn't been able to pay a lovely man called Steve Horry to draw this fantastic illustration on the cover, cool. And to do the little review icons as well. Right. He did for me.
Straight onto Haxion as well.
Yeah, Hexen, what a great movie. Yeah. So the Kickstarter enabled me to pay Steve Horry to get me illustrations. And I think the cover illustration is arresting. It's well done. I'm so happy with it. People constantly praise the cover. They say, "Who did you get?" Steve's really happy with it because people are seeing the cover and going, "Oh, where can we get that illustrator?" So that's good. I think making it look nice. I mean, you can't knock Amazon's tools. You can literally just drop a Word document into Amazon, find a nice picture to stick on the cover, and Amazon will do the rest automatically.
Do you have to pay more for the kind of quality of paper as well and that sort of thing? I mean, is that
this is the standard Amazon print quality?
Well, it's good, but I mean, it's not rubbish at all by any stretch of
No. Amazon's print on demand technology is such that it will look nice. You get the choice between a matte cover and a gloss cover, and you get the cover choice between creamy paper and white paper.
So which ones did you go for on that then? Just for people who can't see the book. I mean,
I've got a matte cover and white paper, and it looks lovely. I'm very, very happy with it. And
academic as fuck.
It is.
It's really interesting.
Well put there, Mr. Jones. Well,
it's really interesting. But yeah, I mean, you can have shiny cover. You can have shiny cover. You can have cream paper. I mean, cream paper looks super nice. It doesn't. I think cream paper costs a little bit more, but not a whole lot more.
We've not really touched on. Howard, are you originally from Swansea?
I grew up in Plymouth.
In the Mouth. Were you from Mutley or the Hoe? Where are you from?
Oh God!
You're from Mutley, were you?
No, I was from an area called Pennycross.
Right.
Which, if you are from Plymouth,
the Mouth.
From the Mouth,
Dirty Janner.
A dirty Janner. Oh my! Yeah, you are familiar with the area.
Know it well. Got robbed there.
That sounds about right. I'm from one of those areas where if you know Plymouth and you name the area, the initial reaction of someone who knows the area is to go, sharp and take a breath through the teeth. And it's like, someone says, "I'm from Clace around here." It's a similar sort of thing.
When did you leave the Mouth?
I left Plymouth in 1994, so I've lived here more than half my life by some distance.
How old were you then in 1994?
19.
Did you ever go to JFK's?
No. Actually, I think I did once or twice in the studio as well. I went to Metal Night at the studio on occasion.
Bet you didn't think you were going to answer that question tonight.
My
did you
God. My God Almighty. No, I did not. But no, I was from a horrible area of Plymouth. I was from an area, there were murders, several murders up and down my street.
Murders up and down the street.
Yeah, there was a social club at the top of my street where something horrendous happened in the women's toilets, and there was a house down the road, and then there was Barn Park where the most horrendous, horrific folk horror kind of event ever happened. So you moved... and I moved here. I came here for university and never left in 1994.
What did you study here, Howard?
I did classics. Now, I used to tell people that actually, there was nothing wrong with having a classics degree, and that, it's not a hamper to your career, and you can wind up anywhere. You could even wind up, dream big. You could wind up Prime Minister. So I keep quiet about that now.
So why did you choose classics then? What was that about?
I couldn't think of anything else to do. I wasn't good at anything else at that point. I'd been so miserable at school that I just decided.
Well, what falls under the category of classics? Is it Homer?
Yeah, Homer. That sort of in Latin ancient history was my thing. But what was interesting was I particularly got into, while I was at university, I particularly became interested in that period of history where things started falling apart. And like the later Roman Empire, the part where the ancient world, it splits into two, the ancient Roman world becomes the Middle Ages, and it became the Middle Ages mainly because there was a huge plague and 3/4 of the population of Europe died, and you had what amounted to the apocalypse happening. And in that period, history got weird, really strange and occult. You had miraculous things being reported as happening alongside historical stuff, and you had entire Roman emperors.
What sort of things there?
Okay, so for example, between the year 383 and 388, a Roman general who was the governor of Britain, called Magnus Maximus, made a play for the throne and usurped the Western Empire. Killed one, there were two co-emperors in the West, and he killed one and drove the other into exile in the East, before eventually being murdered 5 years later by the new Eastern Emperor, a guy called Theodosius. Here's the thing. The longest account anywhere of anything about Magnus Maximus is called The Dream of Maxenoledig, and it's in the Mabinogion in Wales. So the longest account of him is a fairy tale. He appears in the life of St. Martin. St. Martin is a Roman soldier who wound up a bishop, but who has... His biography includes such things as arguing with Satan and raising people from the dead, and also turning up at the court of Magnus Maximus and giving him a telling off for bad politics. You have a Roman, again, a Catholic bishop who was also a political theorist called Ambrose, and he writes in a letter, I met him, and nothing else. There are some coins, but we know nothing about a man who ruled half of the Western world for 5 years, other than the fact that he took a British army down, killed a bunch of people, staged a coup, eventually got beaten, and he appears in a Welsh fairy tale, and that's his longest story.
Is that predominantly because the knowledge of reading and writing was predominantly to the monks of the time and a certain class at the time?
Partly that, partly the simple fact that there weren't as many people around to write these things. So the Romans had concrete, toothpaste, aqueducts, a sewer system and central heating. By the 4th century, that was all gone because the critical mass of people who knew the skills to raise those things had died off in the plagues. And the plagues had brought migrations and things. So this is why you get all these stories about barbarians. Attila the Hun and stuff, who hilariously died of stress-related illness caused by shouting. He died of an aneurysm in the brain caused by shouting so much.
The Visigoths then, yeah.
Yeah, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths and all those people, the Franks, the Saxons.
So sort of, I mean, obviously you're a learning man. So that knowledge that was lost, I'm trying to patch it through my limited knowledge of the subject. Was a lot of that knowledge not written down on papyrus and perhaps lost at the sacking of the Library at Alexandria? Or, I mean, surely they would have kept records.
The Library of Alexandria was a different place in Egypt.
But I thought that, forgive me, how much out of date am I? About 200, 300 years or probably a couple of more?
Yeah, the Library of Alexandria was long gone by then.
Yeah.
I think the Roman Empire, you're writing stuff down, you're keeping it, and keeping it is the difficult thing, right? It's interesting that one of the things that comes out of that period of history is the book as a thing. The Roman book is, of course, a scroll, right?
Right.
and you had a persecuted religious minority.
Christians.
Yeah, Christians, who had this need to carry around a book. And the problem is that the Bible is like 66 scrolls. That's a hell of an undertaking.
Well, it's a canonization, isn't it?
Yeah. If you take the Bible canon as it is, and that's complex, and that's a whole podcast on its own, just telling that story. But it's 66 scrolls, or it's one big ass book. But one big ass book is portable, and there's two things about the book as an object: one, that it's portable, and two, paper costs half as much because you can write on both sides, and neither of those things need to be undervalued. So the invention of the book was about convenience in a time when people had to move around and couldn't afford to that amount of paper. So the book is actually an economic measure. It's an economic thing.
Money driving things again, market forces.
Indeed. Indeed. The evils. Just about sort of lost knowledge, though, Wood. I mean, one of your other pet loves is Atlantis, isn't it? Which you've also written about.
Yes.
And you were saying before The Age of Miracles.
Which was the book I mentioned that came out in 2016, yeah.
Can we plug that a bit more?
Well, I mean, that is a fascinating topic, and absolutely. I mean, is that Room 207 Press as well?
Yeah. You can find that on Amazon. It's under my name.
I mean, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah,
one.
come on.
Well, the thing about Atlantis, and this goes back to my dad's Forbidden Shelf. He had a book about Atlantis, and it's got...
It's a TV series in itself, you know that. You could do sort of...
It's on my shelf. Yeah.
Have you now inherited the Forbidden Shelf then?
Yeah, I have.
You have.
My dad died 17 years ago.
Sorry, I'm really sorry.
No, it was a long time ago. 18 years ago. Wow, 18 years ago. And so Atlantis is a myth, comes from Plato in ancient Greek, and is a philosophical construct to explain stuff. And every so often, people started using Atlantis in literature. And then in the 1880s, there's a man called Ignatius Donnelly, and he was the governor of Minnesota, and he lost his governorship. He got voted out, and he had a lot of spare time on his hands. And as an autodidact and a man of letters, Ignatius Donnelly started looking into one of the things that really interested him, namely the question of why were there pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in South America? Coincidence? I think not. Ron Howard, narrator voice. It was a coincidence. Anyway, he writes this entire book starting from that point, and it's called Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. And he writes a sequel, which is called Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel, which is probably the most metal title for a book ever. And they're huge, huge blockbusters. Massive, massive blockbusters. And they essentially invent the field of fake archaeology as well. Graham Hancock, Eric von Däniken, his Chariots of the Gods.
Fingerprints
of the Gods is Graham Hancock, and Fingerprints of the Gods is called Fingerprints of the Gods as opposed to Chariots of the Gods.
It's a good book, that. I like that book.
Oh, but it's not.
Why not?
Well,
he's going to hit you with science and reality now, probably with actual, factual,
I think
historical evidence.
Hancock's evidence set is flawed. He uses evidence that's actually wrong from the start.
Like what sort of things then?
Well, like, for example, there's an entire chapter at the start of Fingerprints of the Gods about the Peri-Race map. Okay. And half of everything he says about the Peri-Race map is entirely not true. He says things about, like, it's actually got the name of the person who made it on the side.
So what was that map then? I mean, what was that describing?
The map, the Peri-Race map, is actually, it's remarkable in its own right. Because what it is, he talks about places where it's accurate when it actually isn't, okay? But what the Peri-Race map is it's a piece of military intelligence. The head of the Turkish Secret Service in the 16th century had it commissioned based upon maps stolen from Italian and Portuguese ships that they had pirated, right? So they'd basically sort of captured and sunk these Portuguese ships, and they'd stolen their stuff, and they'd found these maps and essentially cobbled together a world map that's not half as accurate as Hancock says it is, not remotely, and it most definitely does not show the coastline of Antarctica, right, at any point. Okay, which is his big thing. Is how could they know about the coastline of Antarctica? It's because he didn't. So it's remarkable because it's a really, really interesting piece of intelligence history, and it deserves to be looked at as a thing of interest. But it's not a great mystery. He makes all these assumptions. There are all these gaps. He says things like, he literally says, when he's talking about pyramids in South America and he's visiting these places, because it's one thing about Fingerprints of the Gods is that it's a ripping read. It's an adventure book in a lot of respects.
It's a ripping yarn.
It is a rip. Well, the thing is, right, the fact that it's a ripping yarn is part of it, because it is a white Englishman's colonial adventure, right? So you have things like him going, I can't believe that the stolid, stupid-looking inhabitants of this era could have built Machu Picchu. Could you? And that sort of thing. And you just think, yeah, but you know what? Actually, they did. Actually, they could. Because actually, he does that thing. He does this thing in the book where he basically goes, was it the circumference of the Great Pyramidic Giza is 2 pi times its height, and the circumference of Machu Picchu, or whatever it is 4 pi times its height. And how could they both have known pi? Well, maybe they might have looked at things and worked it out for themselves, because ancient people were quite smart. Because one of the mistakes we make in history, and this goes back to my stuff about the fall of Rome and that sort of thing, is that actually history is not linear. Ancient people were not benighted. They didn't necessarily, they forgot stuff. The Romans had a form of concrete that when it set, developed bubbles, which meant that if it was placed on a riverside, would get stronger because the sand would gradually move inside it and reinforce it, right? They made a sewer system, an aqueduct, which the northern British are on record as thinking were placed there by gods in the Middle Ages. Right, they're placed there by fairies, right? Because they couldn't imagine building them themselves, right? You have the Egyptians came up with a method of building pyramids that still baffles people. You don't need Atlantis to do this, and this is the big mistake. So Atlantis is a mythical, perfect world. But what interests me is that it got hijacked because it was briefly taken seriously by science, and then it got hijacked by the occultists and the mystics and the mediums, who started placing their own creation myths there. So Atlantis becomes like the foundational New Age homeland. Atlantis and this sister continent in the Pacific, which is called Lemuria, which literally only exists because a 19th century Darwinian guy, in the era before continental drift was even thought of, tried to explain why there were lemurs in Sri Lanka and lemurs in Madagascar. And so he's like, well, obviously at some point there was a land bridge and it sank beneath the sea, because in the Victorian era, the accepted scientific theory was that the crust underneath the earth was on top of a layer of magma, which sort of went like a half-filled hot water bottle, so that if some area went down, another area went and popped up. And that's how they explained how you could find sunken cities and, you know, fossils under the sea, and why you could find, for example, fish fossils in Oxfordshire. You know, and that sort of thing.
I thought that part of the backstory to Atlantis was involving Plato's account, which was based on, was it a great-great-great-grandfather, Solon, or something like that?
It was, but Solon's a half mythical figure anyway. Solon is like a sort of Greek King Arthur figure.
So you doubt his
Oh no, Solon existed.
Right.
There are
okay.
statues of Solon.
Yeah,
He's
yeah.
sort of the thing, but he's one of those figures who comes from a period where Greek history was neither written down particularly, and so he's ascribed all sorts of mythical stuff. Solon pops up in Herodotus as a sort of Merlin the magician figure, almost as an advisor to kings. He turns up and says wise things and then disappears. And so if Plato, who is a clever man, and it's not, you know why he's called Plato?
No.
Because before he was Plato means broad, right? Before he was a philosopher professionally, he was a professional wrestler. Which I love the idea that you might have The Rock retiring and doing philosophy, right? It's just such a beautiful idea. Anyway, Plato knows what he's doing. The fact that he's even putting things in the mouth of his teacher, Socrates, you can sort of tell it's like Socrates does all the philosophy and all the stuff that's right in Plato, but the further on you get in Plato, the less Socrates sounds like Socrates.
Right.
So, I mean, the Atlantis actually comes... He had 2 goes at writing it, and he didn't finish either of them.
Who did? Plato?
Yeah. It's called the Crito, and there's another one called the Critias. It's in
Yeah.
both of them, and in neither of them are complete. Now, one of them finishes mid-sentence. And you've got to think... No one's really sure if he actually finished it or if it was actually torn off at some point. But the point is that it's like he had a go at writing it, and it's almost as if he sort of went, nah, this isn't working. So I'll have another go.
So your book then, The Age of Miracles, was
it's a collection of essays.
Right, okay. Is it a sort of debunking book then?
It's not a debunking book. It's a storytelling book. It tells the stories of various individuals, namely the occult and New Age ones, because they're the ones that interest me. Half of it is the occult and New Age ones. Half of it is the strange history of the fall of Rome, and there's a bit at the back where I tie it all together and talk about things like fake news and stuff like that. So I'm less interested in debunking and more interested in how people come to believe these things and how these beliefs happen and where they are. And I'm actually kind of interested in these stories for their own value. When you have Madame Blavatsky, who comes up with his entire history of Atlantis and Lemuria and the evolution of humanity that's so bizarre and strange and rich and kind of racist that you kind of come up with these. And Madame Blavatsky, I mean, she claims to have been the runaway wife of an old Russian count who turned up in America with having been to Shambhala in the Himalayas and visited the cosmic masters, who now beamed letters written on green ink, in green ink on paper, magically, that would appear out of the air and be written to people who were in the room with her, and they would say things like, "Dear Colonel Olcott, you should really listen to Madame Blavatsky. She knows what she's talking about. Yours, Kutubi, Cosmic Master, similar Himalayas."
Does it come from an insecurity, perhaps, with some of these people to sort of have these large yarns, not wanting to put too much faith in the scientific method, but because they feel perhaps rejected and don't have the ability to understand and do things which are peer reviewed and be scrupulous with their analysis and understanding of how the world works? Do they feel as though they have to invent a history which then they can, or an ideal or an idea which they can then sort of, much like, what's your man who invented the Mormon religion?
Joseph Smith.
This Joseph Smith principle, I'll call it, where it's like, well, I know, but I was told, but don't question me, sort of argument. So that's what I'm sort of trying to get to. Is it a fundamental need of insecurity within the person or persons that come up with these sort of tales?
I'm not sure if it's an insecurity or something. I think that you can't discount the fact that people might actually sincerely believe this stuff. And also the nature of belief is such that when evidence is shown to disprove things conclusively, people tend to double down on what they believe. I think also that a lot of particular leaders, religious leaders and politicians as well, believe that sometimes you have to lie to tell the truth. That people might be sincere believers in things and yet also be perfectly willing to fake stuff. As a student, I worked as an administrator for a Baptist church in Swansea, and the minister of this church who died a couple of years ago, he used to do this. He was hugely successful. He used to do these gospel meetings on Sunday nights where people would come to the front and they'd be saved and all those things, right? And at the end of every meeting, he would do this thing where he would get everybody to bow their heads and close their eyes and then say, if you want to make a commitment now, if you want to come to Jesus, just stick your hand up and I'll see you. And then we'll talk afterwards and no one needs to know. Thank you, sir. Yeah, I see you. Thank you. Yeah. He told me when I worked as his administrator once that at least the first 2 or 3 in any given meeting were, of course, not. That he'd made it up. He made it up in order to convince other people who were genuine to put their hands up. He didn't see anything wrong with that. And I couldn't, and obviously I had no truck with the fact that I was horrified because it's abusive. It's an abusive practice. But he was entirely sincere in his belief that you needed to help the Spirit move. And actually, anyone who knows anything really about Christian theology knows that Christian theology doesn't work like that. But it doesn't matter because he felt that you had to lie to tell the truth. That's why religious leaders and politicians get away with things. Like Madame Blavatsky, there's a story. She sets up eventually the headquarters of her religion, Theosophy, in a place called Adyar, which is near what is now called Chennai, or used to be called Madras.
Right.
And her headquarters, she had this French housekeeper who was totally an accomplice in everything she did, who she fell out with, and the housekeeper set the Society for Psychic Research on her. And they turned up and they said, we've heard that there's a cupboard full of all her conjuring kit that she uses in order to fake psychic phenomena in here. And she wasn't in. It was just her assistant who totally believed in her. And they'd been tipped off, so they went straight to the room with this. You sort of imagine this guy in his shirt, he's sort of bumbling around beside them, and he sort of goes in front, and he's like, no, there's nothing here, it's all real. And the story goes that he banged on the altar and he went, you see, it's quite solid. Bang, bang. And the panel flew open, revealing a cupboard full of all this stuff. And she got away with it. She got away with it. It made no difference to her reputation. And you have to think, what is it about human belief that makes us so willing to accept that? What is it about human belief that, for instance, makes, televangelists like Peter Popoff or Jim and Tammy Backer, all of whom were caught faking. Peter Popoff was the guy who in the 1980s was famously doing miraculous healings and had words from God about what was wrong with people because people had written on pieces of paper what was in it for prayer, and that his wife had read them and was actually transmitting through a hidden microphone.
He got caught. Yeah,
and he got caught with the mic. And 10 years later, he was working again. He was doing it again 10 years later.
There's a quote. I only heard it on QI because I'm not going to pretend I'm intelligent because I'm not. And it was
You're all right.
I'm not. Stephen Fry they were talking about the removal of religion, and I'm paraphrasing, and the danger is if you remove the religious practices and the ceremony, what comes in after it?
I think we see what happens afterwards because
shouldn't that be the case then? Perhaps then it's
a lot of the
devil
alt-right,
that you know.
Well,
than the devil
I don't know. I mean, a lot of the alt-right are basically YouTube atheists, right?
Oh, neckbeards.
Yeah.
Are you talking about Proudfoot? And
we're talking.
Proudfoot?
Yeah, I mean, they've got. They've got neck beards. It's like pubes under the chin, so they're basically more
Well,
like...
I've got a fair growth there. That's because I've been very lazy.
No comment. But
No, it's fine, you can comment away.
You're not very puby. So, but yeah, I mean, they're more you pubes.
Can I have that on my Tinder profile? So it would say Howard David Ingham.
I don't think that's
not
a
very
right.
puby.
We don't go back. Recommend something that's not very puby.
Not very puby is not going to be a winner on
I don't really care, to be honest with you. To be honest with you, I'm not. I think Tinder is like the Argus catalogue of dating, but well, it is really. It's horrific. It's a car crash waiting to happen.
The Argos catalogue is only good in Argos, where it is
or looking
the
for
laminated Book of Wonders.
Yeah.
Yes.
But so you were saying about we went slightly off topic. You were saying about I forget. We were saying about religion and replacing it.
And I mean,
doubling down.
But you've been a man of faith before, though, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've been a practitioner in my time of at least one world religion.
What one was that?
Not saying, but yeah,
you can say.
I mean, I've dabbled in paganism.
That's fine.
I have in the past dabbled in magic, and I am a member. I'm actually proud to be a member of the church in Swansea that held what we think might have been the first legally ratified same-sex church wedding in Swansea. That organises...
Which church is that?
It's Linden Church in West Cross. So
that's by me.
If you are...
There's still hope for you, mate.
Basically...
Nobody take me, mate.
If you're...
Not even a fish.
If you're religiously inclined and, you're gay, you're welcome there. It's the church that runs a refugee support group.
Good.
It's the church that runs the food bank.
Yeah,
and
that's amazing.
I think it's kind of sad that you have to sort of go after you say, I go to a church. You have to then go, it's the one where we actually are okay with gay people and where we're actually friends with Muslims and don't try to, and all this sort of thing. Because of the bad press that churches have brought upon themselves. So I was thinking about this because I've actually, because of my writing, I got excommunicated by a national evangelical organisation in 2004. I was looking this up. The Universities and Colleges Christian Fellowship publicly denounced me because I wrote a journalistic piece about university missions. And I basically said, students are actually quite interested in this, but you're not answering the questions that they're asking, was basically my point. And I just got accused of not being in solidarity with good students, attacking them, satirising them, all those things. And I mean, the University Colleges Christian Fellowship, University Christian Unions are run by a terrifying organisation, very, very conservative, super conservative. But also I was thinking about this because about that time it came up on Facebook, right, that you must never forget that about that time they'd actually rebranded themselves the Christian Union Movement.
Not the People's Front of Judea.
No, think about it, the Christian Union Movement.
Yeah.
And they rebranded themselves that, and that lasted about 11 months before they quietly shelved it and never talked about it ever again. Because someone must have told them what the acronym meant. And that's real history.
I mean, ultimately, though, you've been to America. You've actually, your book was longlisted, wasn't it, for an award ceremony?
Well, no, it was shortlisted.
Sorry, shortlisted. Apologies for that.
So I was actually honoured to be nominated for a Bram Stoker Award.
That's amazing.
For We Don't Go Back, which is, if you don't know, like the big literary award for horror. It's like the horror equivalent of the Hugo, which is what you get for science fiction and the World Fantasy Awards for fantasy. The Bram Stoker Awards are for horror, and I was in the non-fiction category, and I knew I wasn't going to win when I saw the shortlist because it's like, this is one book that was obviously going to win. But I still I wasn't going to go, actually. I knew I wasn't going to win. And then a friend who tragically had an inheritance for the obvious reason at that point basically said, I don't think it's right that you should be going to, don't tell anyone. I don't think it's right that you should miss it. Don't tell anyone who gave you the money. But but I think I'd like to pay for your ticket and your plane fare.
That's a good friend.
Amazing.
And such a good friend. And, you know, he knows who he is. He may watch this. He may listen to this. But yeah, I'm really grateful, and I met some great people there.
I mean, you must have been over
really
the moon to go there. I mean, that's a massive achievement.
Yeah, it's the first time I've actually managed to leave the UK since 2005. So
Where was it in America?
it was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, which itself is quite a strange town.
That's weird.
Well, that is weird.
Tell me
isn't it?
about Grand Rapids.
Well, no, we're just getting into a little bit of the circles within circles thing there, going back over a couple of
Is this
podcasts
folk
ago.
horror?
It's not folk horror specifically, but it's a conversation we had on podcast number 4 with Steve Balsamo, wasn't it? Sort of links, wheels within wheels, that sort of thing.
What are you thinking? Because I have something completely different in my mind.
All right, well, I'll just leave that there for a minute.
No,
But,
say it.
No, well, it just in terms of links with different people saying that.
Well, you know what my solo project's called?
I do, yeah.
Yeah, which is
22 Rapid.
22 Rapid. Yeah. And I should mention, unfortunately, my father's passed away 2 weeks ago.
Sorry to hear.
No, it's not a pity party or anything like that. The whole reason that I chose that was because about 2014, 2013, I was working on a project, and he found a load of old pictures he took when he was in America in 1962, 1963, and actually Iqbal and I were talking about it before we came to the podcast, and it's on the cusp just before. So you look at some of these pictures of downtown Los Angeles, and it's like something out of American graffiti. Right,
Yes.
okay. It is really
I've been
close.
to Los Angeles. It's a strange place.
But these photos are from 62, so it's
Right.
prior, either 62 or 61, so it's prior the civil rights riots and any sort of
All right,
uprising.
yeah.
Okay, so it's very clean cut. But there's a great picture of my dad at Niagara Rapids, and it's very timely to talk about it probably tonight. It's quite nice actually that I can actually talk about it. But yeah, so sorry, where have we gone? We've gone a little bit off tangent.
gone
So
off
yeah,
on a
Grand
major-
Rapids, Michigan is quite an
yeah.
odd town. I mean, it's actually the home of the DeVos family, who own Amway. Well, Betsy DeVos is Donald Trump's education secretary. She is the sister of Eric Prince, the founder of Blackwater, or whatever they're called now.
Military Industrial Complex
Yep.
for hire, yeah.
And her father-in-law, I think, owned Amway, and the hotel was the Amway Grand Plaza. And what you had was this middle of this town that was super, super shiny and super modern looking and super fancy. And within a half a mile in any direction, the town got really run down really quickly. And the roads, I remember having a 27-hour journey to get to Chicago, where I was picked up by my friends Bob and Sue, who I spent the week with, who are basically some of my best friends in all the world. They're just fantastic people. And they were like, you can sleep in the car. It's a 4 or 5 hour journey to Grand Rapids. And the moment we crossed the state line into Michigan, it was like bumpity, 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 bumpity all the way along the roads. So just really bumpy, really, really ill-kept roads. And the people were lovely, really lovely people, really friendly people. The convention was interesting because it wasn't, because it was in the middle of what was called StokerCon. But StokerCon, I know, right? StokerCon, which is like they have every year, they're having it in Scarborough.
Well, they shouldn't they? Because isn't that where
it's the nearest place they could get to Whitby. Yes,
Whitby.
But like StokerCon isn't actually like what you'd expect a con to be. So it was like StokerCon was actually more like a sort of trade conference. So nearly everybody there was a filmmaker or writer or agent or publisher. And all the talks were very cerebral and stuff. And there was one guy who'd come from California who was like 22 years old, and he sort of like he appeared to be like your standard comic book nerd, and he was just like hugely, hugely disappointed because there weren't any cosplayers or hot girls in like dressed as vampires or anything, right? Because he was like he was just expecting a completely different sort of event.
Yeah,
and actually it wasn't. It was an event for writers. It was an event for people in in the industry.
Yeah.
And it was really good. There was a short film competition. I ended up joining the Horror Writers Association as the basis of it, because the Horror Writers Association was just full of such great people, genuinely great people, great men and women, and just really genuine. Because one of the things about horror writers, particularly, more than any other sort of writer, right, is that they get all of the horrible, nasty, hideous stuff out on the page, and they turn out to be some of the sweetest, nicest, gentlest people you've ever met.
In parallels to metalers, who, in my opinion, get some of the most vicious and horrendous things down, singing and playing, and actually are probably some of the most relaxed people you'll ever meet.
Well, I've been to a couple of those gigs recently, and
You're going to say the opposite.
no, I'm not. No, I'm going to totally agree with that.
But I'm going to tie that. I'm going to tie that. Go on, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that I went to a gig last weekend with Chris Organ Mines.
Heavy, not metal.
Heavy. I wouldn't dare say metal.
Don't say metal, because I like my
say
metal.
But no, like great bunch of people, like totally chilled atmosphere, great music. You know, people just cool there, man.
But to come in now, right? So I don't like gore. I don't like schlock horror. I really don't. Right. So, but what I'm going to say is, with what you presented there, spare say one or two, these are films that I actually like, because my frame of reference is Iron Maiden. So Iron Maiden are a band that write songs about wars they never fought in and films they were never asked to write the soundtrack for.
And have a zombie on the cover of all their albums.
Eddie. So there are Hammer horror references in quite a few Iron Maiden songs. So obviously, if you sort of do a little bit of that prior internet, you're reading up and go, what's that reference? And what are they referencing? Okay, so Number of the Beast reference. Is it The Devil Rides Out?
I believe so, yeah.
So obviously, if any Maiden fan worth their salt, or if anybody, into, say, Megadeth or Metallica. I mean, for example, Metallica reference... oh God, tell me his name. Horror writer. Very famous. Inspiration for The Thing.
The
short story. H.P. Lovecraft.
Yeah.
H.P. Lovecraft is referenced in a Metallica song. There's a lyric to the song, "The Thing That Should Not Be, Even Death May Die." So, like,
which is from the Call of Cthulhu.
There we go. Which is also a song by Metallica. It's the last track on Ride the Lightning. So there's this interwoven thing where I sort of like the music and the stuff, but the horror aspect, I'm like, oh no. And
well, look, what's the difference between Hammer horror and folk horror then?
Not a whole lot. Although we did talk a bit about it with Christopher Lee's Dracula and Christopher Lee's short Lord Summerisle, but some Hammer films are folk horror films.
And am I right to say that this kind of genre generally is based on British sort of productions?
Well,
British film?
Not always, because he's got, to his credit, Texas Chainsaw Massacre in here.
Oh, okay. Well, I haven't got that.
Which is a film about veganism, which I recently read about. Being a vegetarian.
That's not actually
is it not
a
true?
bad take. It's not my take.
It's not my take,
but that's not a terrible take. So folk horror originally, because the only film in the 70s that was originally called a folk horror film was Blood on Satan's Claw, which was made by Piers Haggard, and in an interview some years later, he said, I wanted to make a folk horror film. And then Mark Gatiss says, 2010, folk horror is a thing. And people start retrospectively going, oh, that's folk horror, that's folk horror, that's folk horror. And then a writer called Adam Scoville writes a book, got his book about folk horror out way before mine. In fact, I reference it in my book. It's called Folk Horror, Hours Dreadful and Things Strange, or something like that. But Adam Scoville's book on folk horror, he defines folk horror as having various different characteristics. There's an isolated location. There are people who believe something weird, and there's a happening as a result. You can apply that to a whole bunch of things. In the end, I think of that American judge who, when he was asked to define if a film was porn or not, he basically said, I'll know porn when I see it. I'll know folk horror when I see it. It's basically, but I sort of think in my book, I put the net wide. I'm not a purist. So I came up with lots of films. I came up with an idea, a working version of what an American folk horror canon would look like. So films like Carnival of Souls, Let's Scare Jessica to Death, which if you haven't seen, we were talking earlier before we started about films that are in no way good but are also brilliant. Let's Scare Jessica to Death is a great movie, and it is in no way a good movie. So, but it's still fantastic. So there's that, and a Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which incidentally should be held up under the Trade Descriptions Act, because
you're going to tell me it doesn't happen in Texas, aren't you?
No. It's just like only one person ends up killed by a chainsaw in the film. So it's like, is one person is the Texas Chainsaw murder? I mean, he kills two people with a lump hammer, so you could possibly call it the Texas Lump Hammer Massacre. And it's at points like this that I start thinking maybe I'm overthinking.
No.
But yeah. And then I look. There's a couple of Australian movies. Walkabout.
Jenny Agutter
in Walkabout. Underage. There's Waking Fright, which is also a fantastic 1970s Australian movie. There's Picnic at Hanging Rock. And then you can look at other films from other parts of the world and go, actually, maybe they fulfill some of the attributes of folk horror. So, for example, Ring, the Japanese film, because one of the strands of folk horror is about obsolete technology.
Oh, the VHS, yeah, okay.
Or about technology actually being haunted. Folk horror is haunted mainly. There is a sense of haunting in a folk horror film or a folk horror production. You've heard. I'm going to get intellectual at this point, right? But you've heard of.
Oh, you can rule me out of this one.
Jacques Derrida, right? The French philosopher. Yeah. Okay, he came up with the idea of hauntology, right? And he came up with it. He came up with the word as a pun because it sounds in French. It sounds exactly like ontology. Ontology and ontology. And, smoking his fag, beret, like the guy on the Day-to-Day years back.
Nice. No.
But yeah, so Jacques Livreau, Patrick Marber. So hauntology is the idea that history is unfinished, that it has unfinished business with us. And so the haunting is actually a metaphor for the idea of the past, unresolved, coming back and doing a terrorist attack on the present. And a lot of folk horror is hauntological in that respect, not only in the sense that actually now folk horror could only exist as a genre when it's old enough for it to haunt us, which is why when it comes back now, you've got to think about the conditions, because actually in the 70s, right, these things don't come out of a vacuum. So in the 70s, we had a divisive referendum on Europe.
3-day working week.
Yep, so austerity measures, poverty. We had a right-wing party that had no members of parliament, but which was in the news all the freaking time. National Front back then.
Heightened racial tensions.
Yeah, heightened international tensions, and an American president who weathered a years-long scandal about malfeasance during his election campaign, which eventually wound up doing for him.
And he disappeared in a helicopter and cried on national TV, yes.
So...
Where's the link, though,
and
to
also,
folk horror?
A general, well, here's the thing, and also a general kind of knowledge of the occult. So in the 1970s, I've got a copy of a guidebook published by Macmillan, which is a guide to ESP, and it's in a series that includes breastfeeding, car maintenance, cheese making, and flower arranging. And ESP is just one of the things in the guides. You had in newspapers, Sunday supplements, adverts for book clubs, which would sell occult books. You must remember those, maybe. You had part works about the unexplained. on the newsstand all the time. You had all sorts of things like that. Prediction magazine was on every newsstand. It was 35p, and all those sorts of things. And that was sort of a side effect as well, because what you had was a sense that things were a bit crap in the world. History is beginning to make us anxious at that time. You had the 1960s, which were a real celebratory era.
So are you saying, Howard, that social sort of circumstances are reflected in these sorts of genres?
Of course they are.
They always are.
Of course they are.
But
So I didn't want to sound condescending.
Okay, but I'd like to flesh it out.
So like in the early 2000s, for instance, everybody was terrified of Islamic fundamentalism and fundamentalist religion and this sort of sense of things. And suddenly there's loads of zombie movies. You know, it's like that sort of thing.
That's a really interesting connection.
And now we're in a period where it's more like the 70s with the rise of the far right, popular interest in the occult and the weird, fake news, QAnon, all that nonsense, right? It's all over the internet, you know, spooks, creepypastas, all that sort of thing. And all the things that I mentioned in the 70s being a thing again. You know, for a while I worked in a school for a couple of years recently, and I stopped earlier this year, but I knew a witch. The kids who 15 years before would be goths and stuff were now into witchcraft. Right? They all knew tarot cards. Right? Which was really interesting because that's not a thing I've seen since I was a kid. Right? So you have, again, a period where history is unresolved. The 1990s were a period where everybody was like...
Optimistic.
In Britain, Cool Britannia. In America, you had Francis Fukuyama write his book called The End of History about how Western democracy was the end of all history. And suddenly that crashes down. Suddenly, since 9/11, things have gradually gotten worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, or at least we perceive them to, because they've always been bad in other parts of the world. We've just noticed, right? And we're feeling haunted. And suddenly people are making haunted movies, which is why you are now having people making folk horror movies that are intentional folk horror movies now, like A Field in England.
One of my favourite films. That's why I've got them.
Yeah, you've got it open
that's the
at that
page marked.
page.
That's the
I
page
love
marked.
that film.
Robert Eggers' film The Witch. You've got Midsummer that came out this year, Ari Aster's film. And also, actually, you've got Jordan Peele's film Get Out as well, which is basically, in my opinion, the American Wicker Man. In all sorts of reasons that I could sort of explain at length, but that would go there.
I was going to sort of just go back. That wonderful avenue you went down there. I couldn't fault anything you said. I'm totally in there with you. I was sort of wanted to talk to you about my sort of relationship a little bit with horror, because I will pretty much watch. The thing I don't like about horror and a lot of the 80s horror, which is what I was exposed to, is the schlockness of it. Now, I don't mind some video nasties, okay? Driller Killer is awful, okay? It just is. But
yeah, everybody, it's hugely well regarded and influential.
The one horror film I will not watch is Society. And you know,
Brian Yuzna.
Yeah,
now.
I will not watch. I've delved into it. It's not that I have feigning sensibilities, but I just think it's too far. And I would put that in the same category as a Serbian film. I would put them in the same category for me. It's like, I don't care. I do not want to watch it. My horror...
I bet you're not good on Cronenberg either.
I do like some of the body like Videodrome I really like.
Okay.
Did Cronenberg do Coma?
No.
Coma's a great film though as well. That's quite,
I remember.
Yeah, Michael Douglas. Videodrome, who else did Cronenberg do? Existence.
Which is a truly great film.
Okay, throw me another one.
The Fly.
Yes, excellent film.
He did
I don't mind
Naked Lunch.
I don't mind some body horror, but...
The Brood, Shivers.
Scanners is fantastic.
Scanners. Rabid.
Who's your man for Assault on Precinct 13? His name?
John Carpenter.
John Carpenter's one of my favourite directors of all time, purely because I love Assault on Precinct 13. I think it's one of the greatest films ever made. So for me, my relationship with horror is a bit fractious. I'm not the biggest fan of zombie films because I get zombie nightmares.
I'm not a fan of zombie films either.
I think they're overdone. One of my favourite horror movies of all time, and you're going to probably look at me quite strange, is Ravenous. Because I think Ravenous goes down into a mythos.
Yeah, Ravenous is not a bad film at all.
Which is not the Wendigo. I've only ever seen it come up once, and it's in Ravenous. I've never seen it come up. Maybe I'm not that well educated on my horror.
Think about the Wendigo, and I have some friends who are Canadian,
right,
and also who are involved in things like Indigenous rights as well and stuff. So the interesting thing about the Wendigo is that the Wendigo is essentially about an outside creature that swoops in and steals your soul and takes your children and things like that. And actually, the Wendigo is actually basically a metaphor for white people, which is kind of something. Once you think about it like that, it doesn't seem so quaint, because basically the Wendigo story is something that is actually part of a Canadian kind of, as I understand it, and I'm sure that my Canadian friends are going to be watching this and they're going to be going, no, you're wrong. It's part of a Indigenous Canadian sense of wanting to tell a story that is about how they've been wronged and getting away with it. It's an allegory for how they've been wronged through like the last hundreds of years. And I'm not entirely sure if necessarily white filmmakers using that sort of allegory to make a creepy horror story.
There's only been one, which is Ravenous. To my mind.
I know, and actually that's not a bad one as it goes. But Ravenous is a pretty great film, actually.
I was led to believe through what I'd read online that the one of the biggest, and there's a couple of documentaries on YouTube about it, with American Indian tradition, one of the biggest taboos was cannibalism, purely because when times were very, very, very hard, to eat one's neighbours in one's tribe was the ultimate. Well, yes, because nature plays a very cruel trick, because it's, we're going to go into a bit of, I'm no good at science, but CJD, or the human equivalent, if you eat the brains of, say, your own species, there are chemical compounds which can induce madness.
It can hurt you, yeah.
Exactly. So this is why the whole thing about CJD with mad cow disease, because they were being fed their own remains and whatnot, and in effect.
But you see, that's why the Wendigo is white people. Because
why is it white people?
They do that because essentially, because like in the US, it was the custom of scalping was taught to the Native Americans by white people.
Was it really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
So it was white settlers who scalped indigenous people, who then just basically sometimes gave them a taste of their own medicine, right? And then got the reputation for it. So when you have like something like the Wendigo and Ravenous, it's I think the good thing about Ravenous is that it is white people being the kind of cannibals and monsters. And that, I think, is why it gets away with it, although it may not necessarily be my place to say that they get away with it. But it's an interesting film. Anyway, it's quite a fun film as well.
I understand what you're saying in terms of, like, if we're talking, current year with what you've just said. But obviously that film came out in 1998, 1999. I remember there was a big thing because it was Damon Albarn had done the entire soundtrack for it, and it was very interesting. He was using sort of Appalachian style instruments, which were doing around at that point, so banjos and playing them.
So
wrong.
a friend of mine who's into Appalachian folk music actually wrote a piece about that.
He's a fan of Alan Lomax, then.
Yeah, I imagine he probably is. Yeah. But a guy called Craig Daniel did a piece about Ravenous for my blog, which you can find there. My blog, by the way, is room207press.com. Plug.
Why is it 207?
Room 207 Press. When I was at school, my locker number was 207, I came to university and I was assigned in the hall on campus, room 207. And then in my final, I moved out into a house.
You're not having the book, Iqbal, it's mine.
I moved into a house and then I moved back into another student hall and they assigned me room 207. And then in the first part-time job I got where I was making, I was a writer and publicity designer for a software company. My phone extension was 207.
Were you a bit freaked out by that?
By that point, yeah I was. It was
started
basically
wondering.
it's like essentially the number 207 followed me around for a solid 10 years.
I've just thought of something. I want to go tangential again. Can I hoist this up and ask you, sir, may I ask you this question?
Go on, ask me.
Could you regard Dog Soldiers as the beginning of, would that be folk horror?
Because it's Dog Soldiers folk horror. Dog horror certainly has attributes of folk horror, and I like the fact that it's ordinary people. I think of the classic monsters, the werewolf is the closest to folk horror. I think that Dog Soldiers is very much about ordinary people and that sort of thing. It doesn't feel like folk horror. It doesn't have that sense. It doesn't feel haunted. I really like it. I think it's Neil Marshall's best movie. By some distance. I have a sneaking love for Centurion because
I've not seen that.
Oh, Centurion is Bravo 20 in a toga. It's like no seriously. It's like the plot of Bravo 20.
Yeah, Andy McNabb.
Right now, imagine that the Romans, that Andy McNabb is a Roman centurion with a crack group of Roman soldiers who are not trapped in Iraq, they're trapped in Scotland, miles behind enemy lines, and have to get back, being hounded by sympathetic locals and being hampered by untrustworthy brass. It's Bravo 20, only Roman, and the better for it. It's a metaphor for the British experience in Iraq, and.
Has he gone on record in saying that? Are you extrapolating that?
Oh, it's so obvious. When it was made, what it's about, it is the plot of Bravo 20. There is no question of it. It even runs through all the tropes of British soldier movies, right down to the fact that they're all in a trench at one point and the old soldier goes, I'm going to retire after this mission to a farm in Tuscany.
And he's dead, obviously, in the next scene.
In the next 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And that is...
Got a wife and kids.
They talk like British Tommies. They talk like that. And Neil Marshall loves that sort of thing anyway.
I hate to say this, but I figure that we might have to wrap up because Howard, you
it's
need
time
to go.
to wrap up.
Howard, I hope you've enjoyed it because
it's been great.
There's been so much I still want to talk to you about. We say it to every guest, I want you to come back, but I genuinely want you to come back because I have a litany of things I want to talk to you about in terms of cinema. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know you've got to go. I really hope we can get you back for another podcast. You've been absolutely fantastic.
Well, when I got
Howard.
another book out, it's like...
But can we have you before that, please?
Sure, whatever. But yeah, fine.
All right.
Yeah.
The cool kid has spoken.
Right, I'd be happy to.
Thank you very much. So it's good night from me.
And it's good night from me.
Good night.
Good night.